Hello and welcome. I'm Malcolm Cairns, Emeritus Professor of Landscape Architecture at Ball State and co-chair of Indiana Landmarks Historic Landscape Committee. Welcome to all of you, both here and out there, wherever you are out there. Our committee supports the mission of Indiana Landmarks by advancing the standing and preservation of a diverse range of historic landscapes in Indiana. We are currently engaged in developing a user-friendly story map, which will provide better public access to our 300 landscape and growing database of Indiana's historic landscapes. And we'll soon embark on a survey effort to better document our extensive collection of historic design residential properties. As part of our committee's work, it was suggested that Indiana Landmarks host the event that you are attending tonight. If you don't know, you're all part of an extended birthday party in celebration of the bicentennial of the birth of Frederick Law Olmsted, who was born on April 26, 1822. Fred, as his friends knew him, is credited with the founding of the American profession of landscape architecture as we know it, and many of us consider him to be the patron saint of our profession. A prolific planner, designer, and social activist, his work extended from the 1850s to 1895. Even after his death in 1903, the Olmsted legacy continued through the work of his sons, John Charles Olmsted and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who extended the Olmsted-designed landscape distinction well into the 20th century. This year-long celebration in his memory has been hosted across the country by the Olmsted 200 organization, the National Association of Olmsted Parks, the Cultural Landscape Foundation, and the national office and state chapters of the American Society of Landscape Architects. You are now part of this national celebration, and we are particularly grateful to the Indiana chapter of the ASLA for their generous sponsorship of this event tonight. Indiana has about a dozen landscapes whose designs bear the Olmsted name, but only one of them, the U.S. Army Jefferson Depot in Jeffersonville of 1873, dates to Olmsted Sr.'s practice. The rest of the work is the work of the Olmsted brothers, or the Olmsted firm, and include campus planning, site and landscape designs at Notre Dame, the Indiana University School of Medicine in Indianapolis, including the Ball Nurses Garden and Convalescent Park, Indiana University in Bloomington, and Indiana Central University, now the University of Indianapolis, and Earlham College. Further distinguishing this list are the grounds of the Nancy Hanks Lincoln Memorial in Lincoln City, and the extensive landscape of the Hugh McKinnon Landon Estate, which of course we now treasure as the Oldfields Estate at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. It's now my pleasure to pass the microphone to Suzanne Stannis, who will introduce our speaker.
Welcome everyone to Indiana Landmarks Center. I am Suzanne Stannis. I am the Vice President of Education here at Indiana Landmarks. And we also have people attending via Zoom. So welcome to all of you. Great thing about the Zoom technology, it allows us to reach our members not only all across the state, but across the United States. So just a reminder to the people on Zoom that we are using the webinar version. So type your questions in the Q&A, and at the end, we'll take as many as we have time for. Our speaker tonight, Justin Martin's specialty is American history, meticulously researched, but delivered in a narrative style that's akin to fiction. He's the author of 5 books, including Genius of Place, The Life of Frederick Law Olmsted, that's available for purchase and signing by the author in our lobby. Justin's interest in Olmsted dates to 1987. 1 week after graduating from Rice University in Houston, Texas, he was in New York looking for a job. On his first day in the city, following a hectic round of interviews, he visited Central Park for the first time. At this point, he never even heard of Olmsted, but visiting the park seemed like a natural thing to do, appropriate after a stressful day in a large city. Over time, Justin got to know Central Park better. He and his wife were married there in a structure called the Dairy, designed by Calvert Vaux, Olmsted's co-creator. After having twin sons, the couple moved to Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, New York, a neighborhood designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And then a good friend landed a gig giving tours of Central Park, and she asked Justin to be his guinea pig as she tested out her tours. So it's about this time that it occurred to him, this Olmsted guy is following me. So he decided to dig deeper and wound up writing the biography, Genius of Place. Justin is a former staff writer at Fortune. His articles have appeared in various magazines such as Newsweek, Money, and Condé Nast Traveler, as well as newspapers across the country. Justin was born in Indiana, so even though he only lived there for a short time, it's our pleasure to have him back home again in Indiana. Welcome, Justin.
Well, thanks for that very nice introduction, Suzanne. And it's great to be here. What a wonderful venue. And if you'll please turn to page 91 in your hymnals. So my speech, my actual speech tonight is called Frederick Law Olmsted, American Visionary. And first, I'm going to tell you Olmsted's entire life story briefly. And as you'll see, he did a whole lot of different things, traveled down all these various career eddies and dead ends. It was all those different experiences. They all stayed with him. And that's what makes his creation so separate and so set apart. And then I'm going to connect his 19th century vision with the 20th century vision of his sons in the Olmsted firm. And then I'm going to discuss the Olmsted firm, the Olmsted brothers' work here in Indianapolis and in Indiana. So it makes sense to begin at the beginning. Olmsted was, as Malcolm mentioned, he was born April 26th of 1922, of 1822 rather. And so as this is the bicentennial of his birth. And again, as Malcolm mentioned earlier, this has been a big year. It's actually, there's been a lot of celebration of Olmsted this year. There's been a real resurgence of interest in him. Now, Olmsted was born in Hartford. This is a monument in downtown Hartford. If you look about the middle of the monument, you can see the names of some Olmsteds. These were forebears of his who were instrumental in founding the community. Now, Olmsted was born into pretty prosperous circumstances. His father was a very well-to-do dry goods merchant. Now, an experience that would really stick with Olmsted from growing up was his family was in the habit of taking these horseback rides out into the countryside surrounding Hartford. And Olmsted was a little guy, he'd ride on the saddle up in front of his dad. And what he would remember was just for hours on end, his family would ride just without saying a single word in silent contemplation of nature. This would really stick with and shape Olmsted. It also shaped Frederick Church. Church was born in Hartford about the same time as Olmsted. They're actually distantly related, although strangely there's no record of them ever meeting. Church would grow up to be one of the foremost American landscape painters of the 19th century. And this is a painting he did called West Rock, New Haven, which dates through 1849. So when Olmsted was 14 years old, he dropped out of school. That's not unusual in this era, but it did mean he was going to have to find some kind of useful profession. And the first thing he lit upon was being a surveyor. Now, this made eminent sense. Surveying was a very noble profession. But Olmsted did not take it very seriously. While pretending to learn about surveying, he was in the habit of sneaking off, going hiking, canoeing, fishing. As a consequence, he learned very little about surveying, but it certainly served to deepen his appreciation for the landscape of his native Connecticut. Now, about this time, Olmsted's father decided, time for this boy to get serious, time for him to settle down. And so his father arranged for him to move to New York City and take a job in a merchant firm. Now, Olmsted hated this job. He hated the sense of regimentation. He hated the 9-to-5 hours. He hated the feeling of being chained to a desk. But the only thing he liked was periodically he was called upon to go on board of ships that were docked in New York Harbor to inventory their wares. It was while doing this that he hit upon a new possible direction. He decided to become a sailor. Now, once again, this made perfect sense. Sailing was certainly a profession, in this era at least, that was available to someone with limited formal schooling. Olmsted came by this desire honestly. You go back down through the generations, and Olmsted after Olmsted had gone to sea. So in April of 1843, Olmsted set off from New York Harbor aboard a ship called the Ronaldson, bound for China. And on July 4th of 1843, as the Ronaldson was passing beneath the Cape of Good Hope, right beneath the southern tip of Africa, it hit an absolutely ferocious snowstorm. The ship at this point was passing through the southern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, it's possible for weather patterns to be reversed, and you could get some pretty severe winter weather even on July 4th. This one was incredible. Olmsted took a look around at his fellow crewmen. He could see fear in their eyes. He thought, the ship really might sink. About this time, the captain of the Ronaldson gave the order to furl sail. What this meant was roll up the sails. The wild winds were blowing this way and that, and the ship had become impossible to control. So Olmsted and his fellow crewmen, they furled sail, and they went below deck, and for 3 days and 3 nights, Olmsted huddled there as the ship was tossed on the open ocean, completely unmanned, completely uncontrolled. I pictured almost like a cork. Olmsted expected any moment the ship would split open, he'd be pitched into the icy sea into certain death. Fortunately, it did not happen. The ship continued on to China. It delivered its load of U.S. goods, and it picked up a load of Chinese goods for the return voyage. Now, along the way, Olmsted encountered all kinds of privations. He did not get enough food. He didn't get enough sleep. He didn't get enough water. He watched as his fellow crewmen were whipped for even the minorest infractions. And so when the Ronaldson docked in New York Harbor in April of 1844, when Olmsted disembarked on the dry land, he swore never, ever to go to sea again. So this is the very first photograph ever taken of Olmsted. It dates to the 1840s, not long after that ill-starred sailing voyage, and features Olmsted and 4 people from his upbringing in Connecticut who would be instrumental to his entire life. Now, Olmsted's easy to pick out. He's the only person in this photograph not looking at the camera. He's looking off to the side with a kind of dreamy, abstracted expression on his face, typical Olmsted. Now, if you look behind Olmsted, the young man with his head leaning against his hand, kind of a slight smile on his face, that's Olmsted's younger brother, John. And Olmsted has his arm thrown around his shoulders of a man who's staring at it with a kind of fierce, intense expression on his face. That's Olmsted's lifelong friend, Charlie Brace. Now, it's notable that this photograph was taken in the 1840s. In America, we tend to think in terms of generations. The generation who came of age in the 1940s, who fought and won World War II, they're often called the greatest generation. Well, Olmsted's generation, people who came of age in the 1840s, they had their own very distinct generational attribute. They were very committed to the idea of social justice. And in fact, the guy who's been staring at you very intently there, Charlie Brace, he would go on to found the Children's Aid Society, which revolutionized the treatment of orphans in 19th century America, an outfit that still exists to this day. So the next thing Olmsted tried was farming. Once again, this made perfect sense. When I was doing my research, I actually came across a statistic that indicated that 70% of the population in this era was involved in agriculture. So farming was the profession. As was his wont, Olmsted bounced around a bit from state to state, farm to farm, until he finally found a very attractive situation on Staten Island in New York. Now, this is actually an old photograph of Olmsted's farmhouse. And I should mention at this point, I actually serve on the board of an organization devoted to refurbishing this farmhouse. Still exists, is in a state of disrepair, but our hope is to refurbish it, turn it back into something like its former state, open it up as a museum dedicated to agricultural practices in that era, also dedicated to its most famous resident, Frederick Law Olmsted. So Olmsted was a very excitable person, very enthusiastic. And when he was farming on Staten Island, he learned that the French king Louis Philippe had abdicated the throne. He became so worked up that he dashed to a nearby farm to share the news. He didn't even know who lived there. Well, as it turned out, it was a man named Cyril Perkins, and living with him was his 18-year-old granddaughter, Mary Perkins. Now, Olmsted met Mary. He found they had a huge amount in common, but to use the current terminology, he put her in the friendship zone. He didn't see much romantic potential there. However, brother John was then living in Manhattan and studying medicine. He was in the habit of coming in over to Staten Island frequently to visit Fred. He met Mary. They felt very differently about one another. They fell in love and they would get married. So with farming on Staten Island, Olmsted was finally starting to settle in, finally finding a profession that kind of suited his abilities, his talents. But then he learned that his younger brother, John, and Charlie Brace, remember the guy who was staring at you very intently in that earlier slide? He learned that they were planning to take a walking tour across England, and he became almost pathologically jealous. He desperately wanted to go along, and so he started writing a series of letters to his father, in which he begged to borrow the money necessary. Now, in these letters, he comes up with all kinds of reasons he should go to England. For instance, he lists all these health complaints. I think he just made them up. He also suggests that now, when he's a young man, is the right time for him to go to England. If he waits until he's older, maybe he'll be jaded and unable to appreciate the experience. But the winning argument, the argument I think carried the day, was Olmsted pointed out that England was then the seat of scientific farming. And if he were to make this walking tour, he'd no doubt be exposed to various best practices in agriculture that he could bring back with him to his Staten Island farm. Well, Olmsted's father, he always had a soft spot for Fred. He quickly relented, and he lent him the money necessary to go on this walking tour. Now, when Olmsted returned, he was met with a very fortunate circumstance. One of his neighbors on Staten Island was a weekend hobby farmer named George Putnam. Now, during the week, Putnam's job in Manhattan was heading up the publishing firm that he'd founded that bore his name that still exists to this day. Putnam asked Olmsted if he'd be willing to write a book about his recent walking tour. Olmsted agreed, and he wrote a book called Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. Now, the reviews were tepid. The sales were extremely slow. But Olmsted had now made a kind of incredible transition. He'd gone from being a surveyor to a clerk to a sailor to a farmer, so now he toe dipped into writing. And this image I've had up for a while here, this is actually a sketch that Olmsted did while he was on that walking tour that would later appear in that book. So next, an absolutely extraordinary circumstance comes Olmsted's way. The year is 1852. There's a brand new newspaper. It's called the New York Times. It's a startup. And it's in a competitive fight for its life. This is the era when a big city had about a dozen dailies. And so Henry Raymond, the editor of the Times, was trying to figure out a way to distinguish his paper from the welter of competition. He hit upon the idea of sending a correspondent to the South to report on slavery. This was about a decade before the Civil War, and the tensions were running very high between the northern and southern regions of the United States. Well, Olmsted, he applied for this job. He had a 5-minute interview with Raymond, the editor, and he landed this plum gig. And you might be thinking he sounds pretty underqualified, but the Times was a startup. It was in that classic startup, all hands on deck mode. Olmsted did have a writing credit. He'd written that book. But maybe most significantly of all, Olmsted was a farmer, and the South in this era was nothing if not an agrarian society. So in the autumn of 1852, after the harvest was over, because Olmsted was still a farmer by trade, he set off south to the South. He went everywhere, he talked to everyone, and he produced a spectacular series of dispatches that helped put the brand new New York Times on the map. Now, in his dispatches, he provided or produced just a withering portrait of slavery. He had something to compare it to. He'd recently visited those model farms in England. He had his own operation on Staten Island, and he paid his employees, and they were free to leave. At the same time as he was painting this withering portrait of slavery, he also tried to be a very open-minded correspondent. And so as he traveled to the South, what regularly made its way into his dispatches was that he found it to be just a region of surpassing natural beauty. And this image I've had up for a while here, this is another sketch that Olmsted did, this time while traveling through the South on assignment for the New York Times, and it would appear in a book that he wrote on his travels. So Olmsted had now made the transition into what he called the literary republic. And next he decided to take the plunge. He decided to leave Staten Island, move to nearby New York City. He decided to give up on farming, try his hand at journalism. He got a job in a publication called Putnam's, very estimable publication in its day. It was a competitor of Harper's, an incredible stable of writers, Emerson, Thoreau, Longfellow. While working at Putnam's, Olmsted copied a couple of short stories by Herman Melville. But now comes an absolutely cataclysmic event in U.S. economic history. It's come to be known as the crash of 1857. It's a very rapid downward spiral in economic conditions. Putnam's, the magazine Olmsted had been working at, went belly up. Olmsted found himself out of a job. He was low on coal. He owed money to his father and just about everyone he knew. And so Olmsted was forced to take a job, very modest job for someone who'd lately been traveling in the so-called literary republic. Olmsted took a job where he was called upon to knock down structures and drain swamps on a scruffy piece of land, very prosaically named for its position right in the middle of New York City. It's called Central Park. And Olmsted's job, his very modest job, was simply to clear this piece of land for someone else's design. Enter Calvert Vaux. Now, Vaux was a trained English architect. He took one look at the existing design for Central Park. He was disgusted. He could not believe how amateurish it was. And Vaux, he had friends in high places. He recently designed a Fifth Avenue mansion of one of the board members of the future Central Park. So Vaux started approaching the board. I'm going to paraphrase here. He said, in England, where I'm from, if you want the best design, you hold a public competition. Well, the board had listened to Vaux. It tabled that amateurish design, and it announced a new competition soliciting designs from the public. Excuse me, I'm going to take a quick drink of water. So at this point, Vaux sought out Olmsted to see if Olmsted would like to be his partner on the design competition. Now, Vaux couldn't care a whit about the fact that Olmsted had lately been traveling these rarefied circles, part of the so-called literary republic. This meant nothing to Vaux in this context. The reason Vaux wanted to be partners with Olmsted was because Olmsted had been out on this scruffy piece of land, knocking down structures and draining swamps, and Vaux perceived that Olmsted literally knew the lay of the land. So they teamed up, and here it is. This is their entrant in the design competition. It dates to 1858. Now, for Olmsted, this was his very first foray into landscape architecture. And so he brought to this endeavor a lot of innovative ideas, a lot of wild ideas, drawing on all of his previous experiences. Now, there are 33 contestants for the public design competition. 32 of them produced designs that rate somewhere between a B- and a flat F. Olmsted and Vaux, they produced an A+. It was instantly recognized as the winning design, and they won the competition, and they were hired to execute their plan. Now, building a public park is a massive undertaking. And so right at the outset, the board of Central Park made what I think is a very wise decision. They decided they weren't going to wait until the park was completed. That could be 10 years or more, and have some kind of public ribbon cutting ceremony. Could be pretty anticlimactic. So they decided instead that when a section of the park was open, when a section of the park was completed, they would at that point open it up to the public. And so Olmsted, as these portions of the park opened up, Olmsted was very heartened to see that all different kinds of people from all different backgrounds came pouring into the park to mix and mingle. So with landscape architecture, something Olmsted just kind of fell into, he finally found a worthy way to answer that generational mandate of providing social justice. And he would in fact describe Central Park as a democratic development of the highest significance. Now, if you see the inset image here, while Olmsted was working on Central Park, another big event occurred in his life. He got married, and his bride was none other than Mary Perkins, his brother's wife and his brother's widow. Sadly, back in 1857, Brother John had died of tuberculosis. And in a heartrending deathbed letter, the very last words he ever exchanged with Fred, containing a PS, were, "Don't let Mary suffer while you're alive." Well, being a dutiful brother, also in a kind of biblical turn, Olmsted married Mary. Olmsted would adopt the 3 children that Mary and John had together and raise them as his own. He and Mary would also have 4 children of their own, 2 of whom would survive until adulthood. So in 1861, the Civil War broke out. Given everything that Olmsted had seen while traveling through the South, he certainly wanted to be involved, on the Union side. At this point, enough had been completed in Central Park that he felt comfortable leaving employ there, going down to Washington, D.C., and heading up an outfit called the United States Sanitary Commission. Now, this organization just provided immeasurable aid to wounded soldiers during the Civil War. And after the war, through a whole series of convolutions, this very outfit that Olmsted headed up would morph into the American Red Cross. So I think by now I've established Olmsted was a pretty restless guy. About halfway through the Civil War, he started to feel that the United States Sanitary Commission was on steady footing. He felt ready for a next challenge. And so he went out to California and he became the superintendent of a gold mine. This is an actual photograph of the homely hillside on which that gold mine operated. You see the inside image here, that's a stock certificate for the so-called Mariposa Company. I purchased that from a collector. I purchased it from a collector for $7. It's about $7 more than it was worth in Olmsted's day. This is often the case. Olmsted and his team worked the land hard, but very little gold was ever found. So his name is Frederick Law Olmsted, middle name Law. I think it would have been more fitting, perhaps, had his middle name been Serendipity, because while Olmsted was working at that ill-starred gold mine, about 30 miles away was Yosemite Valley. He started visiting repeatedly. He was enchanted. Now, according to one detail I came across in my research, Olmsted was one of the very first 500 non-Native Americans ever to even set foot in the valley. Gives you an idea of how isolated it was in this era. But Olmsted also perceived it was only a matter of time before people started pouring in. He started raising a hue and cry for the federal government to step in and preserve this natural place for posterity. Gives you an idea of how prescient Olmsted could be. This was decades before the National Park Service even existed. Well, the Civil War ended in 1865, and all of a sudden, all these communities around the country started clamoring for parks to be built. Central Park had been designed on the eve of the Civil War, and every big city, they'd wanted their Central Park. But when the war broke out, they'd had to put their plans on hold. Well, now it was almost like a dam bursting with all this pent-up demand, and the natural team to turn to was Olmsted and Vaux. And so they reunited and created a whole series of masterpieces across the country. As their sophomore effort after Central Park, they designed Prospect Park in Brooklyn. I love this image, by the way. It's a tree trimming team on some kind of very tall and precarious ladder. Olmsted and Vaux designed an entire system of parks for the city of Buffalo. And they designed Riverside. I had the pleasure before speaking to talk to some people who are sitting beside me here who visited Riverside. It's a lovely community. Now, Olmsted and Vaux, I like to think of them as kind of like Simon and Garfunkel. They were a very capable creative team, but they did not get along very well personally. They were always at each other's throats. And so at a certain point, their partnership broke up. They would continue to do discrete projects together over the years, but at this point, Olmsted would continue on as a solo practitioner. And in 1875, John Charles, his stepson, then 23 years old, entered the firm. And one of the very first assignments that Olmsted gave to his stepson was he sent him off to Europe on a kind of inspiration gathering tour. The idea was he'd see some of the landscape masterpieces of Europe and kind of absorb them and come back to the United States with lots of fresh ideas. And before he left, Olmsted wrote him a 6-page letter of instructions for his trip to Europe. And I'm now going to read just an excerpt from Olmsted's letter, which will hopefully give you a flavor. So this is Olmsted's letter to stepson John. Everywhere examine closely and accurately all small architectural objects adapted to park work, pavilions, lodges, entrances, chalets, refreshment stalls, bridges, conservatories, plant stands, fountains, drinking fountains, lamps, flagstaffs, seats, railings, parapets, copings, etc. If you find anything novel and good, especially in plan and arrangement, take sketches and notes and be prepared on return to make full drawings. Olmsted was a difficult father, and he could be a challenging boss. But with John Charles in his employ, Olmsted now as a solo practitioner would go on to create an entire series of masterpieces around the country. He designed an entire system of parks for the city of Boston, known as the Emerald Necklace. He designed Cherokee Park in Louisville, along with a whole system of parks for that city. And famously, Olmsted designed a temporary landscape for the World's Fair in Chicago, what was known as the White City. So now we come to 1895 and Olmsted's final major project, his swan song, the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. Now for this, the client was George Washington Vanderbilt, then the wealthiest person on earth. And Olmsted had a gigantic canvas to work on, 120,000 acres surrounding this large house. Now, for such a big project, Olmsted certainly wanted to bring in lots of help. And among other people, he brought in his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who you'll see in the inset image there. He was just a recent graduate of college, and Olmsted thought if he came down to Asheville and served the kind of apprenticeship, he could see if landscape architecture might be the right profession for him. Now, once again, Olmsted proved to be a very demanding boss and tough father. I'm going to read just a brief excerpt of a note that he wrote to Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. It says, review, and train yourself. If you don't get it now, you never will. So I'll also, just as a sort of a side note here, I'll mention going forward now, I'm going to call Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. Flo Jr. to distinguish him from his father, Olmsted Sr., the 19th century figure, just to kind of keep things simple. We got Olmsted, 19th century guy. We got Flo Jr., his son. So the Biltmore Estate was pretty far along when Vanderbilt, the client, decided to hire John Singer Sargent, the great portrait painter, to do a painting of Olmsted. And at this point, Olmsted was an old man. He was in poor health. He was worn down by the demands of this project. And he found that he could only do 3 sittings, or as you can see, standings, before he decided he was just going to go back up to Boston, where he then lived. He figured that people that were there on the ground could finish up the project, see it to completion. As for the painting, Flo Jr. stepped in, donned his father's clothes. This painting was finished with son standing in for father. From a symbolic standpoint, you cannot make too much of this. It was literally a changing of the guard. And sure enough, just a few brief years later, Olmsted, the great man, the 19th century figure, the pioneer of landscape architecture in the United States, would pass away. Stepping into a profession ready-made and waiting for them would be his stepson, John Charles, who you see on your left there, and his son, Flo Jr. And so they would step into a ready-made profession and practice. And here is the headquarters of their firm. It's called Fairstead. It's in Brookline, Massachusetts. Now, it had been before them, it had been Olmsted's home office. And you heard me right, home office, which was kind of a rare thing in the 19th century, but Olmsted had both lived here and had his landscape architecture practice. Flo Jr. would also live here for part of the tenure or existence of the Olmsted firm. And I kind of think if you were to have a landscape architecture firm, I cannot imagine a better calling card than have your headquarters look like this. Now, for the Olmsted Brothers firm, a big part of their book of business always was refurbishing, updating, and so forth, their father's creations. This made perfect sense. First of all, landscape architecture, it's living artwork. It's never really finished. Someone always needs to come in and make various changes, adaptations often to changing times and tastes. And a very good example here is at the advent of the 20th century, automobiles were becoming popular, were replacing horse-drawn carriages. Well, very often the Olmsted brothers were called to go into an existing Olmsted creation from the 19th century and update it with pathways that could bear automobile traffic instead of carriages. And it made perfect sense doing any kind of that work. If it was something that had been done by Olmsted Sr., made perfect sense to turn to the sons. But they also did many original landscape projects, including a lot of park work like their father before them. The Olmsted Brothers firm designed an entire park system for the city of Seattle. They also did a lot of work in conjunction with the national parks. Now, that was an idea, national parks, that didn't even exist in Olmsted's day. But in 1916, the National Park Service was founded, and Flo Jr. actually contributed a lot of language to the original mandate of the National Park Service. I'll read you just a brief excerpt here from something he wrote for that mandate. Promoting public recreation and public interest through the use and enjoyment by the people of natural scenery and objects of interest. Now, the Olmsted brothers, they were involved in Acadia National Park, also Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and also notably the Everglades. You might be wondering, what kind of work does one do with national parks as a landscape architect other than advocating for their preservation? But interestingly enough, it has a lot of correspondence to any other kind of landscape architecture you might do in an urban setting, because of course, a national park, people are visiting, there need to be pathways for them, there need to be rustic shelters built, there need to be scenic overlooks with railings that are thoughtfully placed and benches and so forth. Still another type of project that the Olmsted brothers were often involved in was urban planning. And one of their designs, one of their most notable designs was for Forest Hills Gardens, a community in New York City where I live. And so I like to think of Olmsted, the 19th century figure, as kind of the Johnny Appleseed of landscape architecture. He traveled. It's unbelievable how many places he visited, and he kind of spread his creations far and wide. Well, the sons in the Olmsted brothers firm, they were sort of Johnny Appleseed Jr., and they had the advantage of some modern conveniences, the telephone, automobiles, more reliable trains, and even at the tail end of their company's existence, the airplane. So they also were able to travel far and wide in a Johnny Appleseed-like way, spreading their creations across the country. And this brings us to Indiana, a place where they came and did some very notable work. This is a plan for Indiana University in Bloomington, which they got started on in 1929, doing a master plan. This particular detail it involves a siting of the Memorial Union Building. They cited several buildings. They also, and I thought this was really interesting when I was doing some research on this, they laid out various pathways, and often what they did will follow what is called in the trade pedestrian desire lines. And what this is I'm sure you've come across them. They're places where often people know best. They know the best way to get from point A to point B, and they kind of blaze a trail. And so the Olmsted brothers firm wisely on the university campus there, they decided that some of the ways of getting around, they'd logically already been determined by the students. It was just a matter of paving them. The Olmsted brothers firm was also involved in the Lincoln Boyhood National Memorial. Now, Lincoln, of course, he spent much of his time growing up in Indiana. And so this particular site that was chosen included part of his original Indiana farmstead. It also was the burial spot for his mother, Nancy Hanks. Now, for this particular project, Flo Jr. took the lead. And one thing that Flo Jr. felt very strongly about and really argued for is he thought the memorial should have a real simplicity and austerity in keeping with the public perception of Abraham Lincoln. So he called for this, or his design called for this alley, and then the flagpole in the distance is very visible, that kind of captures your eyes. That was a key element of his design. But if you look at the inset image, another part of his design was he also called for 22,000 trees to be planted, creating a kind of primeval forest. And the idea here was that this forest would kind of resonate, would be suggestive of the pioneer spirit of the Lincoln family. So now we are in Indianapolis, where again, the Olmsted brothers firm did work. And this is the Ball Nurses Sunken Garden and Convalescent Park. This was designed, it was designed so that busy nurses could go and kind of decompress, also a place for patients to find solace. And Olmsted, Sr., he very much appreciated the notion of therapeutic landscapes. In fact, during his career, he designed the grounds of several mental institutions, including notably one in Buffalo, one in Hartford, and also one in Waverly, Massachusetts called McLean. McLean, interestingly enough, Olmsted designed the grounds, and then McLean was where he spent the last years of his life. Well, in the case of the Ball Nurses Sunken Garden, this was a project that was undertaken by the Olmsted brothers firm, but by one particular designer there, which was a man named Percival Gallagher. He was a principal at the firm. And if you look at the inset image, you can see Percival Gallagher on the right, speaking with Flo Jr. in the middle. Percy Gallagher was a very humble man. When I went to search on the internet, there are very few exit images, so you'll have to form your kind of mind's eye view of Percy based on this little snapshot. Now, Percival Gallagher, He brought all kinds of masterful touches to this landscape, including he designed a circular pathway that was meant to really create a sense of calm and contemplation. And now we come to Oldfields. Now, Oldfields was an estate originally designed. The house was originally built for Hugh Landon in 1912. The architect in this case was his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law also tried his hand at doing at least the original landscaping of this estate. But Hugh Landon, his wife died. He got remarried in 1920, and for his honeymoon, he went to Maine. And while he was in Maine, Landon and his new bride, Jessie in particular, were really struck by an estate called the Lamont Estate. As it turned out, the Lamont Estate had been designed by the Olmsted firm, the Olmsted brothers. What's more, it had been designed by Percy Gallagher. And so Jessie and Hugh Landon, they specifically requested Percy Gallagher come out to Indianapolis and do the landscape, a fresh landscape design for the estate. Now, Gallagher brought all kinds of masterful touches. He laid out a double alley of elms. He did the gardening surrounding these various serpentine paths. He put in a estate wall with an ornamental iron gate. But perhaps one of his most masterful touches is what's known as the Ravine. And the Ravine is an example of a hallowed landscape architectural concept called Genius of Place. It's what I took the title of my book from, actually. And the notion of genius of place is that a landscape often has an essence. And rather than trying to turn something into what it isn't, drawing out the essence of the landscape, making it more real than real, as it were, is often a good way to go. And so, as you can see with the inside image, this is one of Percy Gallagher's many, many details and blueprints for this. This was a planned landscape. It started as a slope, and he made it more slope-like and brought all kinds of landscape architectural touches, such as paving it with various stones, the plantings he chose, grading the land, introducing a water element, and also putting in a rustic bridge. And the net result is one of the most striking features of Oldfields, this lovely feature known as the Ravine. So everything I've showed you at this point have been various vintage images of Olmsted and Olmsted Brothers creations. I wanted to close by showing everybody some modern full-color images. I hope what this will do is give people an idea of how many different places Olmsted and the Olmsted Brothers worked, and also how very intact these places are even to this day. Now, for this last part, I'm not going to provide much commentary. One thing I will do is I'll identify the very first part of the slides that I'm going to show are going to be Olmsted Seniors creations, and then we'll switch over and I'll let you know when to Olmsted Brothers creations. So Olmsted designed the campus of Stanford University. Here's Belle Isle and Island Park in Detroit. The Druid Hills neighborhood of Atlanta. Here's the Biltmore Estate as it currently would look. Lake Park in Milwaukee. Here's Shawnee Park, absolutely gorgeous park in Louisville, Kentucky. Here's Delaware Park, the jewel of an entire park system that Olmsted and Vaux created for the city of Buffalo. Here's a modern aerial view of the Capitol grounds. And I like to think of this as Congress's yard. And if you look at the inset image here, that's Olmsted's original 1874 plan. It's a testament to the practicality, also a testament of the beauty of this design that is endured, as you can see, for 150 years without a whole lot of change. And here is Central Park, as it'll look a couple months hence when there's some snow on the ground. Now we'll switch over to the Olmsted Brothers firm. So here is Forest Hills Gardens, the neighborhood that I live in. I'd be remiss, and I'd somehow probably get in some trouble if I didn't tell you my wife took this picture. And here we are in Indianapolis with a modern image of the Nurses Sunken Garden and Convalescent Park, which I visited today. Suzanne dropped me off there so I could walk around for a few minutes, and it was gorgeous. And here is the Ravine at Oldfields. So I want to close by saying it's wonderful that if somebody travels around the country nowadays, that Olmsted's 19th century vision and the Olmsted brothers' 20th century vision is still so very alive and so intact today. Thank you very much. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'll do my best. Yes. Very much so. Even though he was just a farmer at that point, in typical Olmstedian fashion, he kind of tucked away. And one of the really critical things he tucked away was his visit to Birkenhead Park, outside of Liverpool, or inside of Liverpool. And that was the first public park in England, and really a lot of design elements. Olmsted had a good memory. In a kind of a pre-Google age, I always think it was really important if you saw something to absorb it. And so even though he saw Birkenhead Park for the first time as a farmer, and probably several years at least before he got to start on Central Park, without question, and many of his landscape designs take a page from Birkenhead Park. And he saw other parks while he was there, and also very, very significantly, he visited a castle. He had to twist some arms. I'm not sure how he was able to do that because he wasn't that connected, but he twisted some arms to go there. And while he was at the castle, he had a kind of reverie that he recounted in that book, Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. First of all, he thought, wow, wouldn't it be amazing to have inherited this castle? It's been passed down through the same family for 10 generations or whatever. And then very next moment, he had a very American thought. He thought, this is so unegalitarian, this gated castle grounds that one has to twist someone's arms to get onto. So that notion of a public park such as Birkenhead or Central Park, and many of his creations later, or a private ground such as a castle, was something that would really stick with him. Yes. I'm sorry, and I will. The question this time was where did Olmsted learn his sketching techniques, and did he have any formal training? And the answer is no. He was self-taught, and as you see there, he was. His sketches are quite good, aren't they? Interestingly enough, Vaux, his partner, was a fantastic, an unrivaled draftsman. And so those beautiful, you might remember the one from Riverside, the original one for Central Park, Vaux would execute those, because among other things, not only was Vaux an immensely talented draftsman, he was also a trained architect, so he knew how to do that. But yeah, Olmsted was an untrained sketch artist, and in his diaries, you find periodically kind of, they're not as formal as those ones, which ultimately appeared in books, but in his diaries and so forth, you find periodic, just sort of little sketches, whimsical things and so forth, and they show a lot of talent and imagination. Great. The question is, did Olmsted and his firm ever work on cemeteries? And the answer is yes, occasionally. They had fewer of those commissions and some other things which they did. But one very notable one is Mountain View Cemetery, which is now in Oakland, in what's now Oakland. And again, Olmsted brought just to his cemetery work, he would bring a remarkable amount of genius of place, I guess is the right word to use for it. Mountain View Cemetery, one of the things he immediately perceived was it was a different kind of foliage on the West Coast, and much more arid in the case of that. And so he came up with ideas for plantings at that cemetery that would both have a kind of resonance with the kind of formality and somberness of the place, and also would survive and would thrive in that environment. A question, and the second question is there still an Olmsted firm? And the answer is no, there's not, although one would be shocked. I was shocked to learn how long the Olmsted firm existed. So I'll tell this in the form of a little story too, because it really struck me. So Olmsted, he really gets started on Central Park in 1857, and Flo Jr. dies in 1957. And Flo Jr. did not use, he dropped the junior professionally, which was very wise. When I first got started on this project, I thought, I'm supposed to make sense. It seems to be somebody who's working for 100 solid years. And I quickly realized, no, Flo, if it's 20th century, it's probably Flo Jr., 19th century is Flo. So the Olmsted brothers, what you might think of as an Olmsted was involved in the firm from 1857 to 1957, but that wasn't the end of it. It had a lot, to use the modern terminology, the firm had a lot of brand equity. And so it was sold on even after there was no Olmsted involved. And it survived into the 1980s when I think its last gasp, and I don't remember this so well, its last gasp was it was a New Hampshire firm that had the name Olmsted Firm. And that was the end of it. But it lasted as the Olmsted Firm for, what was that, 130 years. Yes. Yeah, some of the hallmarks of an Olmsted design are, just that simple concept that, nature doesn't like a straight line. I mean, they always have an organic, natural shape. He always favored organic, natural shapes, even when it was thoroughly designed. I mean, a roadway or a water element. I mean, a lot of these parks, they're fake lakes. They're like bathtubs. They have to be filled like bathtubs. But the shorelines of these lakes, they look real. They have a sort of a moving line. So certainly, sort of a sense of organic shape, a sense of asymmetry, a preference for the wild. He liked things that look kind of wild and untamed, weren't too neat and manicured. He probably, I'm sure he visited Versailles in France, those geometric gardens. That probably wasn't his favorite. He liked something that was a little more wild. So those are some Olmsted landscape precepts. It was a radical departure from some of the most America in that era, so much more than it is today, was very kind of in the grip of what was happening in Europe. There was a kind of cultural insecurity. And so certainly that formal model, Americans were very aware of it. When people built private estates, they often wanted to show that they wanted to have their own private Versailles in the United States. And so that, what you might call sort of the geometric model of gardening, was one that people were very aware of. But there was also a movement afoot towards more naturalistic designs, and Olmsted wasn't the only proponent of that. There were people such as Andrew Jackson Downing, who was a kind of a predecessor of his, who argued for asymmetry and a more wild aesthetic. Yes. The question is, are there Olmsted projects that are in disrepair or been lost over the years? And sadly, the answer to that is yes. I mean, one of the wonderful things that's happening this year, with it being the 200th anniversary, is it's helping to bolster people's idea that there are so many creations around that are Olmsted creations. And it's like anything else. If someone had a desk and it was just a desk, they wouldn't think much of it. If they told, oh, that's a I don't know anything about furniture, that's a Chippendale desk or whatever, they'd suddenly start to take better care of it. And so, now with a better sense that these are Olmsted landscapes, it leads to people having a stewardship and an ownership. But there's certainly been various landscapes that have been neglected for whatever reason. And just to give one good example, without singling anything out so much, in Buffalo has a system of parks. And one of the parks, and it's actually one of the smallest parks, they just ran a freeway right through it, pretty much destroying the mood of it. And that's pretty, I mean, it'd have to tear up the freeway to undo that. So yeah, to answer your question in short, yeah, sadly, I mean, there are, although people are becoming more and more appreciative, I think, of Olmsted and wanting to preserve these landscapes, there are also examples of ones that have fallen into disrepair. Was there somebody? Oh, I'm sorry. You.
Did he ever publish anything? Landscape finding. And I'm curious if you ever did any plans for a giant farm. Designing architecture farms.
So the questions are, once Olmsted became a landscape architect, did he do any more writing about landscape architecture or otherwise? And also, did he ever do the design for any big farms, like a kind of a farmstead? And so to answer your first question, and this is kind of amazing, after the Civil War ended, along with getting his landscape, he was kind of, this is how Olmsted was. He was trying to kind of weigh his options, and he was a journalist by training. So while he was getting started with things like Prospect Park, he was also co-founding the Nation magazine, which still exists to this day. So that, however, what would happen next was Olmsted would soon be in so much demand that he just couldn't be a journalist anymore. No matter, it's just so much landscape. However, his time as a journalist stood him in very good stead because these are gigantic public projects, these parks or anything he would work on. It was often necessary to fight in the public sphere to get his and Vox or whoever is working his vision seen through. And so he would either go behind the scenes and talk to journalists and kind of plant his side of the story and he spoke their language, or sometimes he would write sort of editorials, arguing for. And then by late in his life, the only writing he really did was he would write sometimes when he was really angry. And a good example here is Montreal, the mountain park in Montreal. He was so angry that I actually think it's a beautiful design, but he felt like they fell short. And so he wrote an angry pamphlet. So he'd periodically write angry pamphlets. He was a good writer in which he would attack a park commission or what have you for not seeing his vision through. As to your second question, I believe there's, and I'm going to butcher the name. There's so many, Johnny Apples is an apt description for him. So many projects, but I believe it's called Sherbrooke Farm in Vermont. I know it's a working farm today. It's an Olmsted creation. I might be wrong here that it was a farm back in the day, though. Maybe it was just a big estate. Maybe someone knows and got turned into a farm. But anyway, there's a farm in Vermont. I believe it's called Sherbrooke. I might be botching it there. That is an Olmsted creation. Yes. That a great question. So as you pointed out, there's he's a mythic figure, and lots of he's entered into the culture and into legend. But if I was to be able to travel back in time, what would I like to see? And just off the top of my head, I guess what I'd say is I'd give the sort of biographer's lament answer to your question, which is the thinnest section, as it is for most people, is the period before they became the person they ultimately became. In Olmsted's case, of course, when he was 4 years old, 7 years old, 12 years old, he wasn't recording it. Nobody else was observing it very closely. So to answer your question, I guess I'd like to go back and meet him as a kid and try to really see with my own eyes, what hints and intimations of that greatness were there. And also probably be interesting to see what types of, how he was just a regular New England kid, going fishing and so forth. So that's what I would want to do. Yes. The question is, did Olmsted work on some gardens in Chile? And although I earlier cast him as Johnny Appleseed, what I'm trying to say here is, though I earlier cast him as Johnny Appleseed, it would be folly to pretend that I'm intimately knowledgeable of everything he ever did. I'm not, but I would guess the answer to that one is no. I don't think he went to Chile to work, but to give a broader answer, every single landscape architect working after Olmsted anywhere in America and probably anywhere in the world is going to be influenced by Olmsted, and many of them have taken a page directly from him. So perhaps that was or perhaps it was a, just speculating, or perhaps it was a employee or of the Olmsted firm, or someone had, it could be something like that. So. Was there a quick question? Who had a quick question? Yes.
Niagara Falls has become a disaster. Tourists trap, things built up around the falls, and he was very into getting the New York legislature to undo it. And it was quite active. Did he take part in any other sort of restoration projects or, recovery projects?
His two major ones were actually the one you referenced. So the question was Olmsted was very involved in the preservation or the restoration really of Niagara Falls, because it had been used as rivers were in that era as an industrial site. It also was used as a site for circuses and stunts, and there was all kinds of signage everywhere, and it was really kind of an eyesore. And so the question was whether he was involved in any other projects, and really his only two notable big projects were Yosemite, where in my speech I didn't go into it in so much detail, but he actually wrote an entire manifesto in which he called for the preservation of Yosemite. And then Niagara Falls, in which he was deeply involved, and very much involved with first of all getting rid of all those carny signs and factories and things that made it unsightly, and then coming up with very thoughtful. This was then the biggest tourist attraction in the United States. And so it was a place, and Olmsted very wisely, he recognized this is not a primeval place. This is a place where humans and nature are going to have to interact. And so he very thoughtfully came up with various pathways and also various overlooks. And interestingly enough, I described how he and Vaux were partners, but then their partnership broke up. Vaux and Olmsted reunited for some of the Niagara Falls work, and Vaux actually designed some railings that would keep people from falling into the falls. So, but yeah, Olmsted did some very, very thoughtful, sort of design of pathways and overlooks and so forth, with the thought that this is a place where people are always going to be interacting with nature. So you want to make it easy for them to do, but also, try to make sure they don't damage the scenery. So thank you very much.
Thanks again so much to Justin. That was just really fascinating. And I know he had to leave a lot out, so you can buy his book in the lobby and he'll sign it for you. So I just want to thank all of our Indiana Landmarks members for supporting us. If you're not a member, we'd love to have you join us and help save meaningful places and work with our historic landscape committee. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.